All right, here we go. And you may notice that this week's lecture title is exactly the same as last week's lecture title, with one exception. I've put a Roman numeral 2 there. We're going to continue talking about American political parties in historical perspective. We got a good overview of that last week, and today I want to focus on a couple different narrower or more focused points. And so just to refresh your memory very quickly, we talked about dividing American history into two major periods. The first, I'm calling prior to the modern era, which goes up until the 1860s, the Civil War, the period in which the current political alignment in which the major political parties in the United States are the Democrats and the Republicans emerge. So there's, the better part of 100 years, 80 years of American history prior to the emergence of the current system. And I pointed out to you, using Francis Lee's interesting scholarship, particularly this recent book, Insecure Majorities, that until quite recently, there actually were two main periods of partisan hegemony or dominance in the United States. The first running from the 1860s to the 1920s, in which the Republican Party was by far and away the dominant party in terms of exercising power via Congress and via the presidency. Yes, there were some periods in the middle of this long run the Republicans had in which there was something closer to stasis, but there's never a period in which these lines go consistently up. So no period of Democratic dominance, just some interruptions in Republican dominance. And then from the 1930s to the 1980s, we get a 50-year period of Democratic dominance, again with some interruptions, but again never with a major swing back in the direction of the Republicans. And so you have two periods of one-party dominance, and then beginning in the 1980s, that alternation between dominant tendencies comes apart. And now we have this period that Lee calls a period of insecure majorities. And as I pointed out to you, this changes the incentives for political action, right, on the part of candidates and parties, that before, in a sense, the fact of one-party dominance gave the party in the minority strong incentives to work with the party in the majority, and in a sense decreased the incentives for the party in the majority to not work with the party in the minority if the party in the minority was willing to join in some kind of compromise and collaboration, right? Whereas in the periods of partisan parity, there's a new incentive, which is if both parties think they can win the majority in the next election by undercutting the party currently in the majority, or by acting in ways that indicate adherence to the ideas of the party faithful, then the fact that both parties can win a majority in the next election increases the likelihood that they will continue to focus on electioneering and not focus as much on governance, and therefore not actually collaborate or compromise with the other party. So we're in a different era in American politics. I then gave you a detailed breakdown, and I'm not going to review this again today, of the different moments in the modern era, both in the era of Republican dominance and in the era of Democratic dominance. I then introduced you to the woman I referred to as perhaps the most successful independent journalist in the United States today, Heather Cox Richardson, who was also one of the most influential and interesting political historians in the United States today, and in particular to her book, To Make Men Free, which is a detailed history of the Republican Party from the 1850s through the present, and then her more recent work, How the South Won the Civil War. And so I'm going to focus today primarily on Heather Cox Richardson's work in order to give us a long history of the Republican Party. If time permits, I will then also turn to Carol Anderson and a little bit of the history of the Democratic Party. So Cox Richardson starts with looking at the grand old party, the Republican Party, as the party of Lincoln, and looking at its emergence in the 1850s, and tells a quite interesting story about the character of the Republican Party when it first gains power with Abraham Lincoln's presidency and the Civil War. And as I pointed out to you, one of, I think, the important innovative things Cox Richardson does is to focus our attention on the domestic policy agenda of the Republican Party in the first Lincoln term. And usually when we look at that period, we focus on the Civil War and its battles. And Cox Richardson says we need to be also paying attention to the very important legislative accomplishments of that first Republican Congress and president. She starts with some historical background, and in particular, and I think I mentioned this in my overall historical overview, the Northwest Ordinance, actually a policy of the Continental Congress, which then became law for the new United States, which said basically that slavery could not spread west to new states or new territories, and that this was an effort to restrict not only the spread of slavery, but also the spread of what Lincoln and Greeley, Horace Greeley, and others called slave power, understood as the economic effect of slavery, which was highly oligarchic or tended to concentrate power in the hands of the few. And so to just begin to spell this out for a moment, that this was extremely important to the structure of early American economic opportunity and stratification. And so the insight on the part of the people who favored the Northwest Ordinance, and then on the part of the early Republicans, is that in slave societies, there's a different kind of economy, that slavery encourages the development of an agricultural economy that is a plantation economy, in which there are large land holdings in which substantial slave labor is employed, and that most white Americans are excluded from slave ownership. Even in slaveholding states, they don't have the wealth required to purchase slaves, and that in a sense, slavery not only is an awful, barbaric violation of the rights of those enslaved, but also a threat to the equality of whites in slave-owning states. And this then is part of the reason that with the Northwest Ordinance, and then getting into the middle of the 19th century, the Kansas Nebraska Act's effort to undo the Northwest Ordinance, more on that in a moment, there's a battle, in a sense, over opportunity for poor whites. And if slave ownership is kept out of the West. If the new territories and newly admitted states don't have slavery, then whites who are dissatisfied with their economic standing in the East or the South can go West, and there will be opportunity for them to generate their own wealth through their own labor. And we'll get more into this, but that if the Kansas Nebraska Act passes, and it did pass in the mid 1850s, sponsored by Stephen Douglas, who we know primarily as Lincoln's antagonist in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he sponsors the Kansas Nebraska Act, which passes in the middle of the 1850s, and basically says that the question of the spread of slavery is a, quote, states' rights issue, or something to be decided by the people of each state and territory, not something to be decided by the federal government. And Lincoln and Horace Greeley and others point out that this is bad faith, that the effort to say, just let the people of each state determine the state's view of slavery neglects the realities on the ground. The reality on the ground is that the very wealthy, very powerful slave-owning oligarchs of the South are using their money, their power, are using violence to export slavery to the Western territories and the new states. And there is open, something akin to terrorist warfare against those who resist slavery, sponsored, funded, armed by the Southern slave-holding oligarchs who see it in their interest to continue to extend slavery, and that this is a major then assault on this structure of economic opportunity. In a sense, the United States, when Alexis de Tocqueville visits in the 1830s, is a society without stable stratification for the white population. The fact that you're born poor does not mean that you're stuck at that station for the rest of your life because of the land that is seemingly infinitely available in the West. It goes without saying, but I need to say it, that what this really means is not only that you're allowing white people to escape from the economy that slavery generates, but not Black people. It also means you're taking territory, land, sovereignty from Indigenous Americans. This is not really unoccupied land. This is just land that is not yet controlled and expropriated by Europeans, but that's a 21st century perspective. Lincoln, Greeley, the mid-19th century Republicans were not very much concerned with indigenous rights, even if they were concerned with poor whites and also with African Americans. Now, I'm going to focus on something that is in your history textbooks and that Cox Richardson focuses on to exemplify what was going on in the South in the middle of the 19th century. And that's South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond's so-called mudsill speech, right? A mudsill is a wooden foundation on which a house rests, and because it's wood, not concrete, the wood is directly in contact with the earth on which you build the home. It begins to rot and deteriorate pretty quickly. And this, for Hammonds, is a metaphor for the spread of slavery, but also the human condition, which is on Hammond's account inherently hierarchical, in which some at the bottom need to be subordinated in order to support those at the top. This is the way Hammond puts it in this famous speech. In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have the other class, which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government. And you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper and vigor and docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for our purpose and call them slaves. We found them slaves by the common consent of mankind, which, according to Cicero, the law of nature is. The highest proof of what is nature's law, we are old-fashioned at the South yet. Slave is a word discarded now by ears polite. I will not characterize that class at the North by that term. But you have it. It is there. It is everywhere. It is eternal, right? And so I hope you see the force of Hammond's very explicit defense of oligarchy and hierarchy. He is saying in the South, right, the necessarily hierarchical, non-mobile, stratified nature of society is built in terms of race. And in saying that, right, he is implicitly denying what Greeley and Lincoln are increasingly discerning, which is that not only does the South rely on black-white racial hierarchy and subordination, but the fact of slavery also makes the South much more stratified in terms of whites, that whites are held down by the institution of slavery, not in the same way or to the same degree as African Americans, obviously, but nevertheless, there is lack of opportunity in the South. And if that system spreads, that will be the case for the country as a whole. And then second of all, right, Hammond says in the somewhat, right, roundabout way, you Northerners also have this system. You just don't use slave labor. And so Hammond is in a sense saying, you know, whether your mudsills are black or white, you must have them. They are indispensable to the organization of any society. And by the way, the rich people, the oligarchs, they're the source of all your progress, your civilization, your refinement. It actually is necessary to sustain a creative class. I'm sorry for using the terms of the 21st century. It's necessary to produce a progressive civilization that it has a class that rests on the exploitation of the labor of another class, right? And so that's the view that Hammond is articulating, and he does us the favor of making it so explicit. And that's the view that Horace Greeley, in particular, the great American journalist, eventually politician in the Republican Party, focuses on. And here, right, Greeley, especially in the aftermath of the Dred Scott case, makes a very important shift in the anti-slavery argument. And I want to be, again, as clear as possible that in the first half of the 19th century, most people opposed to slavery are, quote, abolitionists, right? They say this is an evil institution and it has to be abolished for the sake of the slaves who are treated as chattel property, who are completely dehumanized, exploited, raped, murdered without legal consequence. And not only that, the way our Constitution works, it actually gives the slave owners power, political power, votes based on the number of slaves that they have. It exaggerates the electoral impact of the southern states. That is slave power. It has both a political and an economic face. It is barbaric. It is awful. We need to abolish it. And Greeley, after the Dred Scott's case, after the Kansas Nebraska Act, as slavery appears to be spreading as opposed to contracting in the United States, changes his argument to this anti-oligarchic argument, which says what makes the United States great is the fact that poor whites are not stuck in their place because they can escape their station, use their labor, their hard work, their good luck, their ethic to generate their own wealth, because unlike Europe, we're fortunate enough to have this vast Western expanse. And the result is that we are perhaps the only genuinely democratic society in the United States, right? And you will note the way in which Lincoln picks up on this in the Gettysburg Address, indicating, right, that democracy not perish from the earth, because in a sense, the United States is the only genuinely democratic society because of the attitudes that the presence of economic opportunity generates, right? Again, Tocqueville was very insightful on this in saying that an American servant treats himself fundamentally as equal to his master. And obviously Tocqueville is talking about white people in the North, not white and Black people in the South, and that what Dred Scott and the Kansas Nebraska Act do is to threaten replacing democracy with oligarchy in the United States, to make this as explicit as possible, shifting from an abolitionist to an anti-oligarchic critique of slavery, shifts the group that you're most concerned with, whose interests you justify the critique of slavery from African Americans to white Americans. And all of a sudden, you've got a much more popular argument against the extension and expansion of slavery. It's not just about Black people's rights, it's about white people's rights. So this then begins to set the table for the emerging Republican theory of democratic political economy. That's obviously not Lincoln or Greeley's language, that's my language, but I think this is one of the really important things to see about the Republican Party in the 1850s and 1860s. And I'm going to start with just a little background on the idea of democratic capitalism. I've got all my books on democratic capitalism standing by, and you know, whether it's Charles Box at Princeton or Wolfgang Streeck in Germany, this idea that, in a sense, capitalism and democracy have always been conjoined in the modern world, but they're not easily reconcilable, I think should always be standing in the background when a political party offers a theory of a political economy that is favorable to democracy. How exactly does that work? And I'm going to present this diagram that I've shown you before, which is based on a simplified reading of Wolfgang Streeck's book, Buying Time, and his suggestion that a democratic state is torn between two competing social systems that operate on two distinct logics. On the one hand, it needs to draw taxes from a market economy, and that means it needs to keep investors and capitalists happy so that the economy continues to grow. If they withhold their investments, it doesn't grow, and then the revenue of the state, it diminishes, and the state can't meet its obligations to its citizens. On the other hand, the state needs to be populated by elected officials. Those officials, therefore, need to get the majority of the votes. And more generally speaking, the state, if it's going to be legitimate, needs to be seen as sufficiently responsive to what the voters want it to do. So its dependence on democracy or the public sphere means that the average voter is very powerful, but its dependence on the market economy means that the investor or the capitalist is very powerful. And to the extent, which is almost always the case, that the investor does not want what the average voter wants and vice versa, the state is torn between these two forces and needs to find some way to make both of them happy. Now, I want to point out very quickly that in the period that we're talking about, the 1850s, 1860s, this is much less true than it is today. Because in the 1850s, 1860s, until Abraham Lincoln institutionalizes one, until the Republicans institutionalize one, there is not an income tax in the United States, right? And so actually the majority of the state's funds come from tariffs, not from income taxes, until the 1860s. And that actually stays the case for most of the second half of the 19th century. But nevertheless, I do think that this question then, if you're going to have a polity that depends not only on voters, but also on market actors, and in a sense, it needs to keep both of them happy. How does it do that? And can the state, with the support of voters, regulate the economy such that that tension is, if not removed, at least diminished? And that's, I think, the genius of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party in terms of its domestic agenda, because they start with a central idea, which is that labor produces wealth. And this is, of course, not their idea alone. This is Adam Smith's idea. And I think it's worthwhile remembering, by the time the Republican Party comes into existence, Karl Marx has written extensively about this as well. And we'll see some important actors in the Republican Party actually were quite aware of Marx's ideas. And if labor produces wealth, then allowing individuals the opportunity to use their labor to generate wealth is extremely important to the overall wealth of your society. And this then leads to the, and by the way, I should point out, labor produces wealth, right? It's not just Smith and Marx. Practically everyone thinking about economics in the middle of the 19th century subscribes to that view, right? And so this is not some heterodox view, but what the Republicans do with this proposition, which is to suggest that an economy with individual opportunity for self-betterment through labor is a complementary and cooperative and not a competitive economy. So unlike John Henry Hammonds, who basically says, if you want to have wealthy people, then you have to have poor people. You have to have oppression in order to have culture, civilization, might, greatness. Lincoln and the Republicans say, actually, no. It's better even for the wealthy to give the currently least advantaged economic opportunities to better themselves. Because if you do that, they will make their own wealth. And then guess what? They will use that wealth. They will become consumers. They will buy the goods that the rich manufacture. And so, because your society has more wealth, everyone will be better off. Now, this is not entirely the view of Lincoln or Greeley or the early Republicans. In part, they are suggesting that there's one group who could be richer, who we have to keep from attaining wealth the way they would, and that is the slave-owning oligarchs, right? Because their way of getting wealth is to keep everybody else poor. But please note that even they can be well off, and manufacturers and the emerging aristocracy of industry can be well off, and the poor can be much better off if we allow them the opportunity to better themselves through their labor. And what that means in a still largely agricultural economy is that they can go west and settle land and produce more wealth, and in so doing increase the wealth of the nation and everybody's well-being. I'll just point out to you very quickly that this view of the economy does have a contemporary version. It's sometimes called chain connection. And the basic idea is that if you make the least well off better off, you make everyone better off. That this is sometimes called a bottom up as opposed to a trickle down, sometimes called a middle out version of economic theory, that the most productive place to invest resources, to have public policy focus, is on those at the bottom or the middle, because when their economic situation improves, it raises the floor and everybody else above it as a result. And so this is the opposite of the Republican philosophy under Ronald Reagan, which of course is a trickle down theory. And it's worthwhile noting then how much the Republican Party changes between Lincoln and Reagan. So one first conclusion to this emerging economic theory that is being articulated by Greeley and Lincoln as a democratic theory of political economy, or as they would say, a Republican theory of political economy. Of course, that's democratic small d, meaning a political economy that is not only good for everyone's economic well-being, but is good for democracy, right? Is a political economy that allows people to be sufficiently equal economically and socially that they can then have equal political power, that their rights as citizens can be roughly equal as well. And that is obviously what Hammond is completely denying and opposed to in his mudsill theory of society. So one conclusion then of this economic theory is that a democratic government, a government responsive to the people who have equal rights, political rights as citizens, that kind of government must actively promote an economy of equal opportunity for individuals and for them to better themselves through their labor. Um, and this means, among other things, that the Republican Party begins to be opposed to the old spoils system. And it may not be quite clear why that would be, but if you have a government, or if you want your government to promote economic opportunity through effective policy, then you need effective officials and stable mandates for those officials. And under the spoils system, of course, you were essentially selling offices to those who supported you, and you had massive turnover in the civil service every time a different party came to power. And so, in a sense, the federal government was continually whipsawed and undermined by the way in which offices were filled. And Lincoln and the Republicans begin to say, we may need to reconsider this. If we want the national government to be powerful and competent enough to promote economic opportunity for all, then we might need a different way of filling its offices. The second is that this general idea needs to be spelled out through concrete and specific public policies. And so Lincoln and Greeley and others begin talking about free public education so that everyone can have the prerequisites for economic opportunity. By the way, a fair bit of that education might be agricultural, right? Because if that's the main way people are going to better themselves, you need to know about modern rational farming ideas. And by the way, under Lincoln, the agriculture department is established in the federal government, and the agricultural department, unlike today, is not an institution to subsidize agro-business, but primarily an educational institution to illuminate small-scale farmers about the best techniques of farming. Railroads, right? And so if you're going to go west, right, to get your economic opportunity, what does that mean in the middle of the 18th century? That means going on the wagon trails, which is famously an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous journey. Many people die, many people experience extreme deprivation, get ill, injured on the trail. Why not use this modern technology of the railroads, not only to transport your goods, but to allow people to go west? And by the way, if they go west and they start becoming economically productive, and that results in agricultural resources being present in the West, we need to be able to get them back east where the manufacturers are, right? And so we need a more reliable, speedy, modern form of transport connecting the East and the West. Widespread land ownership. How are the people who go west going to actually better themselves if they don't own the land that they work, right? And so as you know, right, the one of the things Lincoln and the Republicans do is to give land grants to basically anybody who was willing to go west. The second big conclusion, right? So the first conclusion is you need policies and a government promoting equal economic opportunity, and that means both a competent government and specific policies. The second conclusion, in a sense, is just to reiterate where this all starts, that this is incompatible with the oligarchic tendencies of slave power. And so you have to stop slavery from moving west. You have to oppose the Kansas Nebraska Act. You have to reassert the Northwest Ordinance. You have to do something about Dred Scott. Please note that the Republican political platform of the late 1850s, early 1860s does not say abolish slavery in the South, right? That is not what caused the Civil War. It says only stop the spread of slavery to the West. Now, I'll just conclude this section of the lecture with a quick question, right? This is a democratic vision of political economy that depends on the idea that individuals, through their labor on the land, can generate wealth. And that obviously assumes a primarily agrarian economy, an economy in which most people get their wealth by working the land. Is this vision of political economy focusing on individual economic opportunity, self-betterment through labor, and a government that equips individuals to rise economically from the bottom to the middle through their own hard work and good luck? Can it be re-articulated for a post-agrarian age? And please note, right, that the first time we face that question is with industrialization, which occurs very quickly on the heels of the Republican victories and the Civil War. The second time, at least, we face that issue is with the transition to a post-industrial economy. So we are at least 2 steps removed from the economy that produced this vision. Would it be possible to re-articulate this vision today in a way that makes sense? So let me now conclude where Richardson focuses a significant portion of this book. And by the way, her earlier work, I'm looking for, sorry, let me get down in my stack of books to point out that the first book that Cox Richardson wrote was West from Appomattox, The Reconstruction of America After the Civil War, was really strongly focused on this set of policies, which she then incorporates into this book as well. What do the Republicans do to actually institutionalize their vision of an alternative, democratic, cooperative political economy? Well, they continue with tariffs, but they combine it with progressive income taxation. And so tariffs clearly favor industry, right? They say we're not going to let foreign imports undermine domestic industry. Those who sell to make a living benefit from tariffs. Those who buy ordinary goods are often hurt by tariffs. This is the main way we're funding our government. Let's supplement tariffs with a progressive income tax. And essentially, Lincoln and the Republicans invent the idea of progressive income taxation. That is to say, don't tax ordinary people at all, tax those who are reasonably wealthy a little, 2%, those who are very wealthy a little bit more, 3%, right? And so the federal government begins income taxation. That requires that it have the capacity, the infrastructure to actually assess income and tax income. And so this is not only a major change in the philosophy of funding government operations, it carries with it an important expansion in the scope of government action. And speaking of which, right, the entire financial system of the government is transformed by Lincoln and the Republicans, in part because they need to fund the war effort. And it is very difficult at first for them to compete with the South. And so among the things they do is they introduce a national currency. I think it's worthwhile noting, prior to 1860, right, the currencies of the United States were the state monies. After rampant inflation in the North and real difficulty funding the initial stages of the war, a dollar, a US national currency, so-called greenbacks, as a result of the way in which they're printed, is introduced by Lincoln and the Republicans in the early 1860s. They also introduce national bonds. They're having a very hard time financing the war. The bankers of New York are not sure they want to loan to what appears to be a losing cause. And so the federal government starts issuing bonds directly to citizens. Again, a major innovation in American and world politics introduced by the Republicans in the early 1860s. They create an internal revenue bureau in order to impose the income tax. They also impose a domestic tax on manufactured goods, a value added tax, we might say today, in addition to the tariffs and income taxation. They very quickly passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which allows people to go west and claim that land. And please note that up until this point, the land in new territories is sold, right? That's part of what gives the Southern plantation owners so much power and advantage in the new Western territories, is they can afford to buy large tracts of land. And in the middle of a civil war in which the North is desperate for revenues, there was a lot of, obvious pressure to sell the Western lands, but Lincoln and the Republicans say no, we're going to give them away, because if we give them away, ultimately people will generate more wealth, and because we're taxing income and manufactured goods, we will, in the long term, generate more revenue for the federal government. Land grant college plan, another big initiative of Lincoln and the Republicans, to give land to states to use for or sell to fund universities in order to make higher education freely or widely available for citizens. Again, if you want to talk about an anti-oligarchic political program, don't make higher education the province of the elite. Make it available to everyone. And in a sense, Thomas Jefferson had this vision almost 100 years earlier. Lincoln actually turns it into policy with the land grant college plan. The Union Pacific Railroad Corporation, the first federally backed corporation in the United States, and the idea again being to give land and resources so that the railroads could connect the West and the East, make the transit of persons and goods much easier than it had been up until that point, so that this vision of economy with a escape valve, in which if you did not like the opportunity where you lived, you could relatively easily go someplace else and get better opportunity. Hence mobility, hence equality, hence dynamism, That's essential to make the east-west transit path a relatively easy path, not a difficult path. And I won't, given the limits of time, go into the details of what Lincoln says at the Gettysburg Address, to in a sense, not mention the details of all of the policies that the Republicans have passed, but to give us an alternative guiding public philosophy, which places equality and opportunity on equal footing with freedom, and points not only to the Constitution, but also to the Declaration of Independence, with its famous principle that all men are created equal, and identifies that as the national creed of the United States of America, as the principle for which the Civil War is being fought, as the core of the idea of a democratic system in which the government is by the people, for the people, and of the people, right? Lincoln, by the time he gets to Gettysburg, is able to point to all of these legislative accomplishments and to, in this very distilled way, articulate the underlying public philosophy that legitimizes, supports, explains the rationale for all of these policies. Let me stop there. You didn't take my invitation to interrupt me and ask questions. As a result, I was able to get through those initial periods of the Republican Party. Let me conclude by saying this. I started this lecture series by saying the kind of political party that I think a democracy requires is a common good political party. And I think we're now seeing a concrete historical exemplar of what a common good political party looks like. It's the Republican Party of the 1860s. And it's not only the Republican Party that heroically organizes the effort to keep the Union together by defeating the South, it's also the Republican Party that articulates an economic vision that says, if we're going to be a democracy, we need an economy that is a cooperative and egalitarian economy, and that they actually then are able to implement policies that match that vision. It gives us a pretty good idea of what a public good political party might look like. The question is, what would it look like in the 21st century? All right, I will stop there. Who wants to start us out today with a question, a thought, a concern? I'm going to unmute everyone. Your background noise will pick up, right? Who wants to go ahead?
Okay, I think it is also an exciting time in letters. This is where we begin to have our American literature coming into being, and new writers, and actually some of our great poets were Black poets of the second half of the 19th century. We get Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Book on I got you.
And am I talking now, or is somebody else talking?
Well, see, you're talking. We're just picking up a little background noise. If you've got something noisy going on in the background, actually, it looks like everybody's been muted now. Flossie, go ahead.
We get newspapers. We get the beginnings of the Hearst newspapers farther up the line. But it is an exciting time in American letters.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm not only talking about Mark Twain, who is the father of us all, but he's right there with Ambrose Bierce and other writers. And also poets that have had their parents locked up in slavery, and really brilliant poets. So I wanted to throw that in.
Okay, and I'll just, you know a lot more about this than I do, Flossie, but I'm just going to add, right, Captain O'Captain, Whitman, of course, is coming into his own and in this period.
And not only this captain, my captain, but Leaves of Grass.
Well, Leaves of Grass a little bit later, right? But yes, exactly. Yes, good. And we might begin to think about Thoreau and Emerson, who are at once philosophical figures, but also literary figures, right? So yes, the ferment of the second half of the 19th century is when American culture really begins to come into its own. Thank you for that, Flossie. Anybody else?
This is Bob. I was just wondering how Lincoln was able to accomplish all those very progressive things. Did he have super majorities, and where was Mitch McConnell?
Yeah. So think about what it would be like if tomorrow all of the southern states were excluded from Congress. Right. So remember what happens as a result of the Civil War, right? The South withdraws. And yes, the Republican Party won a landslide in the 1860 elections. And at the same time, the opposition decides to declare war and withdraw from Congress, right? And so yes, this is one party rule, and then add to that this is a war administration, right? And remember back to September 11th, 2001, and the very strong Democratic support for things like the Patriot Act, because of the sense that in a wartime, we have to come together. We have to put partisanship to one side. And of course, this is not just a war, this is a civil war, right? The enemy is right next door and in fact, routing us to begin with, right? And so the idea, for instance, a lot of the fiscal and monetary measures that we need to take desperate action to be able to fund a war effort, or else we're going to lose this war. The urgency behind that kind of innovation, right? You know, necessity is the mother of innovation. You're seeing your country torn apart and you're losing all the battles. That will give you a lot of innovation. So yes, it is the fact that you know, if Hammond is the McConnell of his era, all of a sudden he's nowhere to be found, right? He's back in South Carolina, not in Washington, hampering the Republicans' efforts to govern. Anybody having the reaction that I had? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marion, please. You are going to have to unmute yourself. Let me see if I can have help. You know, you're going to have to hit your space bar.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, you can hear me? Oh, good. I'm wondering about the future. I was fascinated by your description of the Republicans going egalitarian, and we know that the Democrats in the 1930s did the same under FDR and Johnson. And all of a sudden, we look at ourselves at the end of the 20th century with equality being less and less available and going downhill. I don't know if that's what you're going to put your discussion on in the coming weeks, but that's always puzzled me. How come we went so quickly in the opposite direction of what both parties wanted?
Yeah.
And thank you for the question. And I'll just point out to you, if we look at the historical arc between 1860 and let's say 2000, it isn't just equality from Lincoln to FDR to Johnson, and then things go south. By the 1870s, 1880s, late 1870s, early 1880s, the Republican Party is firmly the party of big business, right? And the Democratic Party is, in part, the party of racial hierarchy in the South, right? And so, by the way, we then get in the early 20th century Teddy Roosevelt, right? The trust-busting Republican. And then we get Hoover, right? And then we get Roosevelt, right? And please note, in addition to Roosevelt and Johnson, you might mention Eisenhower as being an extremely important mid-20th century egalitarian, right? And so all of that to say, and Cox Richardson tells this story of Republican oscillation between being a party of big business and returning to the principles of Lincoln, that pendulum swing occurs several times before finally, in the second half of the 1960s, the Republican Party seems to go very firmly in the direction of being the modern or contemporary Republican Party, which has much less interest in equality, either racial or economic, than it did for the previous 100 years. And so yes, we've got to figure that out, and that's the second half of the story of American politics in the modern era. What happens to the party and the constituency for equality that makes it so unstable? Why was a egalitarian political economy not self-sustaining? And there, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to start talking a lot about race again, but we're also going to have to start talking about the dependency of our political parties on money and who has the money. So that's just a little preview of the themes to come next week, where we get out of the 1860s and very quickly come forward to the present. I am not going to try to give that lecture today, just the promissory note that it'll be there next week. Anybody else with a question about today's lecture?
I just wanted to make an interesting note that, or comment on your turn of phrase, and then everything went south.
Yes. So some of you may know Ronald Dworkin. And he's no longer alive, a very influential legal theorist. I happened to know him in graduate school and a little bit after. And I remember a striking conversation with him at one point in which he says, wouldn't it have been interesting if Lincoln would have just let the South go? Right? What would the United States be today? And I said, well, wait a sec. If Lincoln let the South go, what about slavery? He says, oh, well, slavery was a dying institution in the 1860s. It wouldn't have lasted very long. I'm not sure he was right about that. And certainly when we look at that laundry list of accomplishments of the Republicans of the 1860s, I doubt Lincoln could have got much of that done without the war. And so it's an interesting question, right? That the South hampers equality, and yet the effort to bring the South back into the Union generates this very important period in transformation in American politics. Joanne, go ahead. I can't hear you. I think you need to hold your spacebar down or hit your mic. Try again. No, I'm still not hearing you. I'm sorry. Do you have a microphone icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen? If it's got a red bar through it, just click it. On my end, you're unmuted. If you're doing the space bar, you can't just hit it. You have to hold it down. I'm still not hearing you. I'm sorry. Are you gonna try to type it in the chat bar instead? That would be another option. So I'm going to make a suggestion. Amy, you're still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Can you maybe at some point try to help Joanne and see what's going wrong with her effort to contribute? And then we can start next week with her question, because I don't want her to get frustrated.
Joan Grossman?
Dykstra.
Oh, Joanne Dykstra.
Yeah. She's trying to speak, but it's not working right now. And so if you can help her, then we can start next week or if anybody else who
Sure.
knows their way around Zoom can help Joanne. Sorry, Joanne, but let's start off next week with your question, okay? All right, everybody, have good weeks. Take care. Happy birthday, John. And I will see you next Saturday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure.